Now the first primary mistake when it comes to the sujood is very, very important. It's the most common mistake. It's the one mistake that most people who have problems with the sujood, they're going to have problems in this area. And that is, the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to have 7 parts of our body touch the ground and be firm into the ground when we go into the sujood. Now this problem here with this mistake is, for some musallin, for some of the people who pray, they don't have all 7 parts actually touching the ground. And we've talked about this before. Now the Prophet ﷺ mentions these 7 parts, we all know what they are. They include the nose. Now with the nose, some of the ulama have a difference of opinion, believe it or not, what is exactly a nose. Because what they say is the nose, it has a particular bone or a joint area, and some ulama have a khilaf of whether this part of the nose and the forehead actually counts as 1 or 2 separate parts. And why do I say that? Just imagine if you're going into sujood, and when your nose is onto the ground, some of the ulama encourage to try to get this inner part of between the forehead and the nose to try to touch this to the ground. And the reason why is, even the Prophet ﷺ mentions that the athar of sujood is also found here in this place. It's not just in the forehead. You know, some people have that dark spot on their forehead. The Prophet ﷺ talked about this and mentioned that this spot here, if it was done and it was brought to that person and they're given this sujood mark, then insha'Allah ta'ala, Allah will cause that spot to be brighter than the sun on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So some of the ulama said to achieve this, one of the ways is to perfect the face when it touches the ground for sujood, and part of doing that is to try to get this area to also touch the ground. Now let me tell you, that's not easy. It's very difficult. As a matter of fact, you might even find yourself pushing, literally forcing your head into the ground. Now you don't want to force your head into the ground, but just apply some pressure that is comfortable at the same time. That's number 1. Then the 2 is the hands. Then 3 is the knees. So what are we at here? We are at 5. And then 6, 7 is the 2 feet. All 7 of these parts of the body have to be firmly placed into the ground. Now there's a couple of issues here. The first issue is, how do you perform a perfect sujood? Now when a person performs a perfect sujood, from the mistakes, this is the second mistake of the sujood, is when people go into sujood, their hands are placed to the ground but their fingers are spread apart. The Prophet ﷺ sunnah of going into sujood is hands or fingers are together. And the reason, the hikmah behind this, of course, is all the fingers face and point towards the qibla. Secondly is the palm area. The palm area is extremely important also for it to be firmly placed into the ground. Don't just have your fingers like this and just have them resting on the ground lightly. Try to keep your entire palm into the ground as well. When it comes to the hand, the third mistake when it comes to the sujood and placing the hands is the arms touching the ground. The Prophet ﷺ made a tashbih and said that this here, when you do that, it's like the sitting of the dog. When the dog wants to relax, what does it do? It takes its 2 front paws and lays it down into the ground. And so it does the same thing with its back legs as well. The Prophet ﷺ says, don't imitate the animals like this when it comes into the sujood. Even Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah tells us that a person who imitates any animal in their sujood, فَقَدْ أَبْطَلَ الصَّلَاةِ, then verily their salah is broken. So you have to be very careful of how the sujood looks. Even some of the ulama said, don't make your sujood resemble like the curls of the snake. What does that mean? Some people, when they go into sujood, their nature in sujood is that their body is, how can I say this? It's not consistent. In other words, their body looks very messy when they're in the sujood. So you'll have like one of their feet pointing this way, another feet pointing that way. One hand is straight, the other hand is probably this. It's just a lot of careless little detail that they miss out with the sujood. And scholars, they say this is very similar to how a snake will sit and relax itself. that a snake will start to curl itself, but its head would probably be popping out, its tail would pop out this way, and all of these different features about them. So it's a very, very intricate detail about the sujood you try to perfect as well and avoid. When it comes to the feet and the knees, I don't know until this day why some Muslims, they do this. But some Muslims, and I'm sure some of us here, we've probably seen this, that some Muslims, when they go into the sujood, they'll raise their feet off the ground. I don't know what that's for. I don't know if they're just airing their toes or what it is, but they'll just raise their feet off the ground. I've even seen like people who play with their feet at the same time. You know, I've even seen some people scratching their feet. They use one feet and scratch the other feet and do all of that while you're in sujood. Remember, brothers and sisters, that being in sujood, you're the closest to Allah Azza wa Jal. Imagine if you are the closest to your Rabb, and this is the nature you meet Him in. It's really, really a very, very careless manner to be in front of Allah Azza wa Jal in this particular state. And this is why I've always said that people today, especially in Salah, do a lot of crazy things. A lot of things that were unheard of. I mean, sometimes when I try to research some of the things that I've seen people do, I can't find them in any of the old books. I have to look for them in more of the newer books that scholars have written, because these things were simply not understood or they weren't aware of back in the day. So that's important, is that we try to keep our feet firmly into the ground. When it comes to the toes should also be bent in such a way that you try to do this to the best of your ability, that your toes are facing towards the Qibla as best as possible. Next mistake is when the feet are down, you want to try to keep the feet touching each other as best as you can. So the heels, so imagine this is the feet. You want the heels to be able to touch each other as best as you can. And this is something that also the Prophet ﷺ, it was narrated by some of the companions that they used to witness this from him. That every time he would go into the sujood, he would be together with his feet. So I hope, inshaAllah, that kind of at least helps a little bit of how the sujood should look.